Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our 1 hour facilitated conversation this afternoon, Elder Rights Advocacy, a 30-year celebration. And when you think about it, 30 years ago, it really would have been very hard to imagine the dramatic recent expansion of elder rights advocacy that we in the media know all too well about, and the future challenges that face the organisation in the aftermath of the Royal Commission and various other inquiries. So here we have ERA, Elders Rights Advocacy, auspiced with the Older Persons Action Centre in Ross House years ago, set up originally with a staff of just 3 to advocate for Victorian residents of Commonwealth-funded nursing homes and hostels. And what a way it has come. I know that Philippa, our CEO, is going to speak to a lot of the journey that the organisation has been on, its role in OPAN, and the particular challenges for advocacy, the challenges that have been brought on by the impact of COVID in all of our lives, and a broader conversation with our panel a little bit later about a human rights framework in aged care, which is really one of the most pressing things that need to be considered as the new Act is formulated in the Commonwealth Parliament, that we really embed human rights in the aged care system, residential aged care system, and the aged care system more broadly, which I think has been the purpose of all these decades of advocacy. So wonderful to be with you all. Welcome to everyone here. We're pleased today to have an acknowledgement of country from Vicki Walker, who is a senior Indigenous woman. She's an advocate herself. She knows a lot about advocacy, and so wonderful and appropriate that she could provide words of welcome today. Just getting that ready. She's pre-recorded those comments for us today.
Hello everyone. I would like to acknowledge that I am on the land of my ancestors, the Yorta Yorta people. I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to my elders, both past and present. And we always need to acknowledge our elders because of the work that they've done to pave the way to give us the opportunities that we have today. I would also like to acknowledge all the traditional custodians of the lands we're coming from today, and to each and every one of you. My name is Vicki Walker. I am a very proud Yorta Yorta woman, lucky enough to have lived and worked on my country all of my life. And when I talk about being proud, it's not a stubborn or selfish pride, but an absolute warmness of heart, knowing exactly where I've come from and where I belong. I'm always really honoured when I'm asked to do an acknowledgement of country. An acknowledgement of country is really an opportunity for anyone to be able to perform, to show respect to the traditional custodians and our connection to country. I always like to try and explain a little bit about the significance of our connection to country. So we feel like country is family. We visit country, we sing and talk to country. When it hurts, we feel its pain. And when it's healthy, we feel its warmth. We love country, and when we've been away and we arrive back home, it feels like country is giving us a big warm hug. I'd like to wish a big happy 30th anniversary to the fabulous team of people who work with Elders Rights Advocacy. And I know and admire so many of you and the work that you do, particularly with our Aboriginal elders and community organisations. Congratulations. I look forward to joining you all a little later. Please enjoy these fabulous guest speakers. In the words of our traditional language, 65,000 years old, Ya, Yapaniye Puk Anganya. Walk together, friends. Thank you.
And we thank Vicki very much for those heartfelt words and that acknowledgement to country. Before we begin the formal parts of this hour, the engagement, the advocacy, the debate about issues, it's appropriate we take time to acknowledge those elders living in residential aged care who died as a direct result of COVID-19. We want to think about those people. We're going to think about their family, their friends, and we'd like to take the opportunity to have 1 minute of silence. And so I'd ask everybody to observe that now. Thank you, everyone. Very appropriate. I'd now like to welcome some of our special guests. I welcome everybody who has joined us for this conversation today, an important conversation. But I'd particularly like to welcome Victorian Human Rights Commissioner Ro Allen, who is with us. Say again a particular thanks to Vicki Walker and a particular welcome to staff, volunteers and board members who are with us today. The current members of the board are Mary Ann Hunt, who is the President, Liz Grove, the Secretary, Naresh Raja, who's the Treasurer, Carolyn Carroll, Sonia Demetza, Hasey Tobias, Jan Porter. We'd like to acknowledge outgoing members of the board, Georgie Landau, who's given 15 years to the organisation. Acknowledgement and thanks also to Jim Brown and to Melissa Griffith, who were also on the board this last financial year. Jim's tenure was 5 years and Melissa 12 months. So we're going to get underway now with the formal part of this hour with an address from Phillipa Campbell, the CEO of ERA. Philippa had been acting in the role for just 1 month before the COVID pandemic hit. In 2020, now obviously confirmed in the position, she is going to give us an overview of a remarkable past 12 months and plans for future growth. Philippa. I think you might just be muted there, Philippa.
The good old mute question. Hello, everyone, and welcome. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Phillipa Campbell, the CEO of Elder Rights Advocacy. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and their continued connection to land, sea and community. I pay my respects to them and their cultures and to elders past, present and emerging. I also pay my respects to First Nations people who I know are here with us today. I welcome you all to this important 30-year anniversary event and thank you all for your interest in and involvement with Elder Rights Advocacy. We have a few apologies that I'd like to acknowledge today. Dr. Kay Patterson, AO, Age Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Dr. Patterson, who has passed on, her best wishes for this event. Anthony Carbines, MP and Victorian Parliamentary Secretary for Health and Parliamentary Secretary for Carers and Volunteers. He too passed on his best wishes. Professor Bryony Dow from the National Ageing Research Institute. Ken Thornton, former board member. Marie McCabe, CEO of Dementia Australia. Tina Hogarth-Clark, CEO of COTA Victoria. And of course our own Cassie Brown, our navigator, who has just become a new mum to Spencer, our first ever baby, I think. I too want to acknowledge and thank retiring board member Georgie Landau for 15 years on our board, many of those as president. And Mary Ann Hunt, our current president, who will serve out her time of 10 years on our board over the next 12 months as we make the transition to a new president. I acknowledge and thank past and current board members for your leadership, support and guidance. I also make special mention of our program manager, Debra Nicholl, who has been with ERA for 15 years, and of course all staff and volunteers past and present. Such commitment from you all. The success of Elder Rights Advocacy is because of each and every one of you. Thank you to our funders, contractors and suppliers. It's been a massive year with lots of change. Thank you and welcome to our participants for today's very special interview and panel discussion. And of course, thank you to Alan Fanning for facilitating this special event. Well, here we are celebrating 30 years of advocacy services to older people in Victoria. And as I've said before on many occasions, and know many of you too, wouldn't it have been lovely to be meeting in person? However, there was a moment in time we had to call it, and yes, it needed to be a Zoom event. Now I just hope that all the technical things work, that Australia Post doesn't knock on my door, that my dog doesn't bark, or in fact join us. She has joined on many staff meetings and now shares the title of CEO, Canine Executive Officer. If she does, this is my life, this is our life. 30 years, it seems like a very long time. However, when I started to put some thinking to today's event, I had the realisation that I sit here before you as the face of the organisation with a working history of 30 years plus too. How time flies. I've decided to take you through my last 30 years of work, not in too much detail, as it will add some context to today's discussion and a couple of themes will become evident. 30 years ago, I was fundraising to purchase knives and forks for a newly built not-for-profit aged care facility so we could finally welcome new residents through the door. The first dementia-specific facility in Metro Melbourne. 31 beds, purpose-built, 4 small houses, fresh food, fabulous care, and up to 8 residents in my care. We knew the residents' needs and preferences intimately. 28 years ago, I was a project officer tasked with setting up a head office for the same not-for-profit organisation. We built another 2 facilities, 31 beds, purpose-built, 4 small houses. We knew the residents' needs and preferences intimately. 24 years ago, I became the manager of a brand new aged care facility for the same not-for-profit organisation, tasked with commissioning the building and welcoming new residents and staff. We threw traditional shift times out the window and rearranged staff to work around times that are influenced by resident choice. Breakfast was whenever residents chose to get up. They participated in the running of the facility, and the chef cooked meals to suit 45 residents from 27 different community groups. Its 4th facility, 45 beds, as 31 was no longer viable. Still, 45 residents, we were able to maintain fresh food, fabulous care. However, staff had up to 12 residents in their care. We still knew the residents' needs and preferences intimately. This was also in 1997, the year the Aged Care Act was introduced, accreditation standards. Soon after, low care and high care were merged. People living with dementia were separated into dementia-specific locked wings. Keypads turned up on all external doors, and no one was to be given the code. It was during this time that I was fortunate enough to meet Mary Lyttle, the CEO of Residential Care Rights, now Elder Rights Advocacy. Mary would come and provide information sessions for residents on their rights in residential care. 20 years ago, still with the same not-for-profit organisation, I was asked to manage one of 2 aged care facilities that were taken over due to non-compliances. Poor care, poor food, neglect and more. Government officers there on the doorstep for days and weeks. After lots of hard work and many long hours, what a wonderful facility that ended up being. Be off with you, non-compliances, not under my watch. It was not long after this time that I experienced the sector becoming tighter, harder for staff, lots of rushing around from resident to resident, task-oriented, residents in hospital being labelled bed blockers, and meanwhile, I was asked to tighten the budget. $6.50 per resident per day for food, only 4 care staff per shift, cuts to activity budgets, shaving off, scraping through. Staff resident ratios became non-existent, and the copious paperwork that needed to be completed for each resident on a daily basis was obscene, and nobody had the time to read it anyway, all ticking some boxes. 45 beds became 60. We began to struggle to know the residents' needs and preferences intimately. 18 years ago, I took on the newly created role of quality manager for the same not-for-profit organisation. Aside from being tasked with ensuring 8 facilities achieved accreditation, my role was to ensure all the paperwork was completed. Some of you will remember those days. Audits, tick sheets, 30-page care plans, audits, and more audits. Much of shift times for staff were taken up doing the paperwork. Nobody had time to read. 60 beds became 75. We were losing sight of what we were there for. Viability and paperwork were the focus. Knowing the residents' needs and preferences intimately was becoming a distant memory. 14 years ago, I had an epiphany. I was then responsible for the quality of eight facilities, 7 in Metro Melbourne, 1 in regional Victoria and a retirement village, also in regional Victoria, for the same not-for-profit organisation. It was on day 2 of an accreditation visit of a now extended 90-bed facility because of course 75 beds weren't viable anymore. The emphasis on paperwork, which of course nobody had time to read, was the focus of the auditors, not the quality of care, the food, the attitudes of staff, or the opinions of residents and their family members. Paperwork. I felt defeated. It was that night I wrote my resignation, after which I left that not-for-profit organisation and took 3 months long service leave. I was tired of the system, tired of the paperwork, tired of residents not being front and centre of everything we did. I was tired of us no longer knowing the residents' needs and preferences intimately. 90 beds became 120 beds. Many long-serving residential aged care managers and dons left the residential aged care sector during this time, completely disillusioned. 13 years ago, I became one of the founding staff members of Seniors Rights Victoria. Funded by the Victorian government, we were the first Victorian specialist community legal and advocacy service for older people who were being abused. We were focused squarely on advocating for the rights of all older people. A manager, an advocate, a lawyer, an education officer, and a statewide 1300 number. And off we went, establishing the service. I was that advocate. I had found my niche again. 11 years of assisting older people who were being abused by family, many of them ending up in residential care. I ended my role as advocacy manager at Seniors Rights Victoria with a casework team of 4 advocates, 4 lawyers, and we couldn't keep up with demand. It was heartbreaking to know what family members could do to older people. 3 years ago, after a damning investigation by the ABC into the aged care sector, a Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety was announced to look at the quality of care services and whether those services were meeting the needs of the Australian community. This included the care for older people living at home, people living with dementia, and people living in residential care, including younger people with disabilities. 2.5 years ago, I joined Elder Rights Advocacy as a specialist elder abuse advocate, after OPAN received funding from the Commonwealth Government to assist older people who are being abused in residential care. Full circle. During this time, I visited many aged care facilities, now so big that on arrival, receptionists would look residents up on the computer to find out which room they were in because they didn't know them by name. 150 plus beds, some 200, large institutions. How on earth can staff know residents' needs and preferences intimately? A little over 2 years ago, carers successfully tendered for 2 new contracts, the Community Visitor Scheme, or CVS as it's known, and the Navigator pilot program. We were growing. The CVS program is a social visiting program for older people living in their own homes and in residential care. We match volunteers with isolated and or lonely older people, and they visit, call or write to each other on a regular basis. A fabulous program filled with so many lovely stories of friendship. We currently have 70 plus volunteers matched with 90 older people in 5 regions of Victoria. And as you can imagine, we would love to grow this program because it is so valuable for both older people and the volunteers. The Navigator pilot program was introduced by the Commonwealth Government to assist older people and their representatives to navigate the complex aged care system. For us, our target group is older people who are vulnerable and hard to reach. Recently, we were able to expand our program, and now we have 2 part-time staff in this area. 18 months or so ago, I can't remember time these days, I commenced as the acting CEO for Elder Rights Advocacy, and very soon after we heard the news of a possible global pandemic. We were thrust into coronavirus crisis planning meetings. I looked back in my diary, and on the 16th of March, we met to start writing up a pandemic plan, led by past board member, Jim Brown. I was hesitant. We were all hesitant. Jim wasn't hesitant. Do we really need this? Isn't this a bit far-fetched? Not long after, we made that swift scramble home. All staff in our 4 offices across Victoria moved to working from home, all without too much thought, because this was temporary, or so we thought. You all know this point in time very well. In Victoria, COVID became our focus and the impact was heartbreaking. It was during these early times that I felt that I was running uphill backwards, with skates on and with no brakes. I'm sure many of you felt the same during that time, and perhaps some of us still do. It is here I pay tribute to the many residents who lost their lives during COVID, their family members and friends, the community surrounding them all. The loss of lives in residential care was significant. The loss of lives in Victoria was significant. It consumed us all. And I pay tribute to our staff who were on the phones during this heartbreaking time, day after day, week after week, month after month, and we are still here today. At one stage, our advocacy team couldn't deal with the volume of calls. So OPAN stood up across the nation and helped us. The strength of having a national network was truly evident during this time. As the impact escalated, we heard about aged care staff being stood down due to COVID infection, residents infected, surge workforces, furloughing, PPE, locked gates, residents locked in their rooms, poor communication, phones unanswered, isolation, visitors and care partners locked out, the media, the sector was in crisis. Still, at the end of the telephones, we tried to stay strong. Day in and day out, our advocates across the nation continued to answer calls for help. OPAN and Elder Rights Advocacy met regularly, planned our approach, and together we engaged with those facilities significantly impacted by COVID-19 in Victoria. We facilitated resident and family meetings to try and ensure residents and family members knew what was happening. We invited public health officials and clinical team leads to give updates and answer questions, often at night, and with families who had lost an older family member, for some 2 family members. Big breath. Thank you. Thank you to our staff and volunteers who pivoted with us, and to all of OPAN, and in particular CEO Craig Gear and others. CODA Victoria, CODA Australia, Dementia Australia, and to Gerard Mansur, Victorian Commissioner for Senior Victorians. We all came together in Victoria to plan, review, replan. We supported one another to support older Victorians, which we were still doing today. And to the providers and facility staff we spoke to, often in tears, as we called around as many aged care facilities that we could to see how they were coping and to ask whether we could do anything more to help. We were all trying to manage the unknown. The impact of COVID has been significant for each of us and for many of you. While we too were in lockdown, working from home, and for many of whom our staff were caring for children, homeschooling, caring for older parents, or just trying to cope themselves. We were there to support older Victorians, and we are still on the phones responding today. The impact will be with us forever. Very hard to move on to achievements after that. However, despite COVID, life at ERA has had to continue, and we have achieved so much of late, all while working from home and through many lockdowns and reopenings. Today, we remain working from home. So let us now try to celebrate our recent achievements and our plans for the future growth. In the last 2 years, we have received 20,000 plus phone calls. We've provided 15,000 plus hours of service. We've supported 8,000 plus clients with our advocacy service and Navigator trial service. We've facilitated nearly 6,000 volunteer contacts with clients in our Community Visitor Scheme program. 115 volunteers have provided support to over 407 clients in our Community Visitor Scheme. We set up 2 additional regional offices. We rebranded our website and other organisational collateral. Our staff worked with a lead on our submission to the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and participated in the development of many OPAN submissions. It was around this time we heard talk of the need for aged care facilities to be smaller and a renewed emphasis on the human rights of older people. Who would have thought? We became accredited for the first time, a requirement of our National Aged Care Advocacy contract. Working from home for an extended period meant an investment in IT. We commenced our portability project, and all staff IT systems were upgraded to enable staff to not only work from home, but to pick up and work from anywhere. We moved to the cloud. We learnt about Zoom. We engaged Dr. Catherine Barrett to lead our new diversity project. This resulted in the recruitment of elder rights advocacy ambassadors across many diverse groups, including the LGBTIQ, transgender, First Nations, care leavers and forgotten Australians, people living with HIV, CULT communities and more, educating our staff about their communities and how they want us to engage. A groundbreaking report, Reaching Out. Thank you to Dr. Catherine Barrett, who is here with us today, and to our inaugural ambassadors, many of whom are also here with us today. We recruited a specialist diversity and inclusion advocate to develop relationships with all diverse communities and to adopt and grow our new ambassador program. Due to increased funding and extensions to contracts, we expanded our Cvs and Navigator program workforce. We employed a communications and marketing coordinator to grow our brand and presence, and an information and education coordinator to review all of our information and education programs and to develop a peer education pilot program focusing on First Nation communities and care leavers and forgotten Australians. A big thank you to our peer educators, some of whom are here with us today, a wealth of experience. We participated in 2 interviews for the independent review of COVID-19 outbreaks in Australian residential aged care facilities. In response to the Royal Commission to Aged Care recommendations, the Australian Government Department of Health acknowledged the important work of OPAM through the National Aged Care Advocacy Program, and we have recently received significant increase to our funding next contract. This has and will result in significant growth, extend our reach and benefit more older Victorians through increased access to frontline information and advocacy services. This rapid growth needed to be well considered and planned, so we contracted Dr. Susie Goldsmith and her team at Goldsmith Consulting to complete our first service model review in 30 years. Thank you to Dr. Goldsmith, who I believe is here with us today, and her team. We brought together a staff guidance team and a steering group. It was around this time that we heard from Margaret O'Callaghan OAM, who had contacted us to become involved with ERA again. Of course, we jumped at this opportunity and Margaret joined the steering group. Now completed, the service model review, coupled with our experience and knowledge, we have commenced our future growth strategy, which has commenced with a new intake worker. So busy, we now have 3 intake workers who are the first point of contact for all callers, triaging our 3 programs. New advocates, we've recruited new advocates in geographical areas identified in our service model review. And we recently recruited our first dedicated First Nations advocate community development worker. Over the next 3 years, we will expand our information and advocacy services further. We hope to hold on to and grow our very important Navigator and community visitor programs. And it's with much pride that we will soon launch, in Mary Lyttle's name, the Mary Lyttle Scholarship. We now concentrate on the management of rapid change, strategic planning, and operationalising our plans. And finally, I've been ageing during these last 30 years, as have you. My hair has turned grey. I've allowed my wrinkles to stand proud. My back and shoulders ache from time to time. We took the baton from Margaret O'Callaghan, Mary Lyttle, and others. We stand on their shoulders and continue to focus fundamentally on the human rights of older people. We hope that the staff that we bring on today take that baton and stand on our shoulders into the future. The last 30 years have flown, and in the next 30, it could be us in need of aged care services. The human rights of all older people will remain our focus, my focus. If you are lucky enough to grow old, will you settle for anything else? Thank you.
Wonderful words, Philippa. Thank you so much for those well-structured words, those thoughtful words, and we can hear in what you've experienced as an advocate, the trauma that so many Australians, particularly older Australians, have experienced in the last 2 years. It's wonderful that we have Margaret O'Callaghan with us. This afternoon, as you said, founding member of Residential Care Rights, auspiced by the Older Persons Action Centre. Margaret now lives in residential aged care. She trained as a nurse, has further education in psychology and a range of other disciplines, is a great-grandmother, mother, wife, activist, and has been advocating for the rights of others for more than half of her life. But Margaret, you say that when you first went into residential aged care, despite that experience and expertise at advocating, you weren't good at advocating for yourself.
No. I've got to look at my script.
No, don't. Just talk to me.
What I've found was it was awfully difficult to come from one situation to another when you've been away from contact of people like Mary Lyttle for a long, long time. And the service actually moved forward. And I would say that had to be from Mary's clear guidance and leadership. If she wasn't a clear leader, I think the service would have died a long time ago. It was an idea of older people themselves. And I think that's what I'm I suppose, trying to respond to that, to have the recognition for those people who set forth with that idea in the first place. They weren't going to take no for an answer. They were keeping at it and on it, and knowing all of those kind of people who were there, they did it very effectively. I could recall going to different departments with various people. I'll name a couple of them: Jane Williams and Des Farley. Des was an accountant, certified practicing accountant, but his health was declining. Jane Williams was a woman who would never give up. She thumped the desk. She appeared to I suppose, someone in a department, more particularly the State Department, thumped the desk and told them, this is what we want and this is what we're getting.
So can I ask you then, you were a bit of a desk thumper yourself. You were, as a nurse, someone who knows how to assert yourself in a respectful way. How is it that when you got to aged care, Margaret, that you struggled with that?
I was helpless. I had nowhere to go. I think the aspects of it, that I had a husband who was 7 years older, whose health was declining, and he wanted to be in his own home environment. He didn't want hospitalisation. In fact, in one hospitalisation, I was angry when I read it later, his report, because it was holiday time and we didn't get it for 2 weeks. And in the first statement, he had said that he had to be discharged because he had to get home and look after his sick wife. And he was the sick one. Mm. He had a specialist at Monash who diagnosed that he had epilepsy. And he had 2, at 90, he had 2 epileptic seizures in my presence. I think it was always engineered for my presence, because he preferred the 2 of us to be in the one room to save on electricity and heating, all these kind of things.
And that's what's interesting about your story, is it's a very common story and not one we hear often, which is that one party needs the care, one partner needs the care. And so you went with him to residential care because that was considered the thing to do. But
not quite.
But
when he was in there for a year before,
right.
In visiting him, he saw me as the enemy. He saw me as the person who deprived him of his liberty out there. That was one of the reasons he wanted to go home. He perhaps didn't realise that I wasn't very well at all myself. But you put your needs on hold, and perhaps give in to someone that you've lived with for 60 years in a
Yes.
compromised situation. And that's where it starts.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people out there who are in that kind of situation that really don't know where to start.
Yeah.
And particularly if there's dementia that isn't recognised, and I don't think I did recognise his decline.
Yeah.
It was very subtle, and we were using other things as the excuse for why he was sick. He had, he had actually 3 visits to hospital, and some of them, the doctors kept contacting me.
Yeah.
I had my own problems.
Yes.
But they didn't go through other mechanisms. It was the telephones.
And this is another element of what we want to talk about, is that these challenging life circumstances emerge. Residential aged care is seen as a solution to the challenges. And so that's where you are. And you've been very frank about the fact that it took you a while to find your voice and to be able to advocate for yourself. Then COVID came along. We've just got a few minutes left, Margaret. Describe for me very precisely what COVID has been like for you.
COVID, I think because of the long experience of it since March, the 24th of March, 2020. My husband died months after that. And I think I coped with COVID itself, because if you don't follow the directions that are expected of you, the legal directions, you're affecting other people. You actually aren't all alone. But I did think that I was the only one that had the problems. It took a long while for my family to be able to reveal to me, to say, we've got problems too. You know, you're not the only one. Stop feeling sorry for yourself. So on those grounds, I tried. There were such things as if the caring role from others is not effective, you are left alone to your own devices, how you can do it. And so I was regarded as a busybody, and I've seen other older people defined in that terminology. A busybody who poked her nose in where she shouldn't have poked her nose in.
And this is when you were trying to advocate for others, asking about how others were getting on and so forth.
Yes, and some of it's very simple things, maybe because of my experience of people with dementia, that I'd learned techniques. And I think that's what we have to reclaim, that there are nurses who the government has a responsibility to train those people with special skills to train others. It's a sad loss to a community of older people where there've been staff who've actually spent 20 years of their life advocating for others, doing all the dirty jobs and not seeking a reward for it. They keep mentioning, and I'm sick of hearing it, I even heard it today, I'm busy, I have to keep going. Now, who are they serving? The system, the institution, or whatever out there. Many of them are from other countries who are seeking full employment and want to stay in Australia. I think that's something we have to address very rapidly. I sense the government, because of lockdown, should be rewarding people who stayed in the nursing home, risking their own lives, who are offered measly little money, as if you'll stay on next year, we'll give you a bonus. It's not to everyone who that is offered. Now, that's an insult to people that I see in the paper where offered, or their pay is $2 an hour less than retail workers.
Yeah. Now, Margaret, we're going to start a panel discussion now. I'm going to ask you to stay on and give us some reflections at the end of that, because we're a little short on time. But thank you for that. No, not at all. Thank you for raising particularly the point about your own experience, how hard it is to advocate individually, and how hard it is to go up against an institutional system where the institution dictates individual relations rather than having a person-centred approach. And that's very easy with funding models for any organisation to fall into. So thank you for that, and stand by. Our panellists today, we should bring those folks up onto the screen now. And we want to start by introducing them. Bro Allen, give a wave, bro. There you are. You see, we've all got our technique down, waving. Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commissioner, thanks for joining us. Debra Nicholl, Programs Manager at ERA, thanks for being there, Debra, you're in Adelaide. Marianne Hunt, ERA and OPAN President, and Mary Lyttle, about whom much has been spoken. ERA CEO, former CEO of 27 years standing. Now, let me turn to my notes. Thinking about all of this, let's start with Marianne, if we can. What are your reflections perhaps on what Margaret said about how COVID has impacted the sort of all the cracks that we know exist in institutional care?
Thanks for your question. It's magnified it. I would say 500 times, because older people, because older people in this country, when they enter aged care facilities, it's not a home, it's an institution. And older people in this country are the only part of our society or community who are institutionalised. So their rights were taken away. They weren't allowed to, when lockdown happened on the 24th of March 2020, and there are still some people in lockdown today, and they have not been out of lockdown. They've been denied access to their family and friends. They were actually even denied access within their home environment or within the facility to go and see their friends. They were often locked in their own rooms. And served their meals on a tray, didn't see someone for days, weren't allowed to exercise, often didn't have the same workforce or staff supporting them, so there were strangers. They had lost their friends to COVID, so friends had died, and often they never were told that they had passed.
Yeah.
They lived in fear of their own life because they didn't know what was happening. No one was communicating what was going on.
Yeah. And can I say to Mary Lyttle on those points, while the specifics of the pandemic are extraordinary, to what extent is this an echo of the very same issues that you were dealing with decades ago?
Unfortunately, Ellen, all too familiar. You're right, there's been a magnified impact with this crisis of the pandemic, but then some of the framework that we saw for years of limiting people, not looking for opportunities to do what could legitimately be done to keep people in touch and communicate clearly, help them understand what was happening. Too often that wasn't worked at. And so we had the code of visitors being drawn up under pressure from advocates and Twitter and other consumer groups to say, we have to find a way. Those of us in the community were getting access in some ways to visitors or to being out for exercise or something, as Marianne said. And this wasn't being supported in the same way in residential care.
And
so
do you see that
is,
as something, sorry to interrupt, we're short on time, but do you see that as a function of a failure really in this country to grapple with the fundamental human rights questions as opposed to well-meaning codified sets of standards and so forth, the sort of paperwork that Philippa was talking about, Mary Lyttle?
yes, I do. I find it instructive over the years. I reflected on some of what was happening in the UK because at the time prior to Brexit, particularly, they were subject to European conventions on human rights. And so they had to have that embedded, and people therefore could challenge that in residential care and other forms of care to say my human rights are being abused. We need a much stronger focus on that in this new act.
Debra, Nicholl, let's come to you. Wow, it's been a time. It's been a time, Debra. Just personally reflect on us. You were a carer for your mother and were working for, just take me through the last 20 years, which was pushed into the last 2 years. It seems like 20, but it was about 2, I think, now.
Yeah. Last 20 years. Yes, I went to pick Mum up during a break in the lockdowns and brought her home for a 4-week stay to give my sister respite, because Mum has dementia and she needs, fairly constant care. So my sister's 4-week respite turned into a 5-month respite, which was fabulous for her and actually good for me because it gave me a chance to spend some time with Mum, and of course gave me a renewed appreciation for the issues that carers have had, particularly during COVID and being locked down, but also generally. But Ellen, I started working in aged care back in the mid-70s, and for really aged care has been a big part of my life. And what I've heard from older people, and certainly in my discussions with Margaret more recently, is that, they just want their fundamental human rights respected. They want to be given choices and be able to make their own decisions about where they live, importantly, how they live. And also, we've been told so many times over the years, we don't want to be rushed. We want enough staff on the floor, if we're in resi care, to be able to care for us in the way that we are most comfortable. And we want them to be trained properly. We want them to know what it is that they are doing. And of course, the whole COVID overlay, I totally agree with Mary and Marianne, the whole COVID overlay, we went from a health emergency into a health crisis because of the workforce issues that have always been there and indeed, came to the fore during COVID.
That's very much, and that's very much what Margaret was saying too. Just very briefly, Marianne, before I go to Ro, let's just make the point, we're not only talking about residential aged care here. No. We're talking about older people, our elders throughout the community. And just spend a moment or two reflecting on the sorts of issues and difficulties that were presented by COVID, which again are an exacerbation of the sort of issues that have been dealt with by this organisation for 30 years.
Yeah. So one of the biggest things was that, and Margaret spoke about it when you interviewed Margaret just a moment ago, around those health crises that happen for older people at different points in their lives, which trigger a need for additional support. Our society isn't about reablement. It's about actually, okay, you've got this issue, and you're old, so we'll just put you here, and with no choice. And we as a society, we don't listen. We don't listen to older people, what they want. And they have been telling us for over 30 years, they don't want to live anywhere else but their home. And they want to be able to access the services that any other person in society does. So I suppose that the biggest issue is that when people had that significant health event and then needed additional support, often the only option was aged care. And if there was an outbreak within an aged care facility and people wanted to go home, it took OPAN and Elder Rights Advocacy a lot of work with government to actually be able to, for the people to actually come home with a carer and support but that was limited too. So I suppose what it demonstrated, COVID has demonstrated that, which we knew, the system is broken.
Yeah.
That we don't, in this country, we don't cherish human rights. So that's about how do we participate? How do we move in our society? How do we contribute to our society?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me draw Ro in on that, because Ro, it's wonderful to see you. We could easily, you could easily say, well, look, there's the Commonwealth is responsible for aged care. The states run something. The interface is too complicated. And while the sign on my door says the Human Rights Commission, I really can't help you. I couldn't insert myself in the middle of that jurisdictional spaghetti.
Well, I could, but of course I won't, Ellen. Look, I just first want to acknowledge, and I know you're running out of time, but I want to acknowledge I'm on Wurundjeri land and pay my respects. And I have to acknowledge Philippa's contribution. Clearly, you brought me on this panel just to educate me, and I have been, and I would use my time to listen to you, Margaret, all afternoon, all the Margarets and Marys. And but really, you can't, and it is complicated, and it's our job as commissioners to try and simplify that, and also put an intersectional lens on the whole thing as well, because we're talking about elders, Aboriginal elders, multicultural elders. You've talked today about LGBTIQ elders, regional, metro, and yes, I think for me, one of the reasons that I accepted this invitation is because when I arrived as the Human Rights Commissioner 5 months ago, I was pretty alarmed to see that our complaints are very low for seniors in our community, very low. And I'm aware of the issues, and I've asked the question of my staff, why are they so low? So happy birthday, Elders' Rights Advocacy. I'm looking forward to another 30 years of working with you to figure out why our complaints are so low and how to get that smooth transition between Commonwealth and state. And we're very lucky in Victoria to have Gerard Mansour as senior, and he and I are looking at a project together. And I think for me in Victoria as a Human Rights Commissioner responsible for everybody's human rights is how can we form those partnerships with Gerard and with Kay Patterson and others to make sure that we are going in the same direction, because frankly people don't care whether you're state, federal, they just want their rights, and it's really up to us to try and navigate that spaghetti, I think you called it.
And do you see your office playing a coordinating role? Can you see yourself inserting yourself into it, or merely saying, yes, we'll take it all, but then we'll refer you to this Commonwealth service or something, or some other way of dealing with it?
We absolutely have to. If it's a Commonwealth funded and run service, we have to send it to the Australian Human Rights Commission and to the Federal Aged Care Discrimination Commissioner. But we can do it in a warm referral. We don't have to just go, here's the phone number, good luck.
Sure.
There's ways to make sure that we have a really client-centered approach to how we do this. I have a dream about complaints.vic.gov where, we could get all complaints for all things. Because often you're not, you haven't got one issue, you've got multiple issues with multiple parts of departments. And if you can get onto the right person and hang on through the hold system, you want all your issues solved in one place. So
that's it, by the government. I don't care
the government.
Which one?
Yeah, that's right. It is difficult, but I think the first thing is to see how we can get the number of complaints to rise. And I think there's this, and I could be shouted down, but there's a sense to me, a culture of, well, they don't care, or nothing will happen anyway, or, this is my lot in life. What am I going to, why should I complain? And I just want to turn that around somehow. My next, what's a 5-year appointment? I've got 4 years and 6 months left. I'd love to see one of the outcomes that we get those complaints up, not because the issues are worse, just that seniors really believe that if they make a noise that something will happen and they'll get hurt. And it's certainly my commitment today is that I'm happy to get in there and be part of that.
Mary, that brings you to the actual importance of advocacy. First of all, did you think you'd be still having this conversation 30 years later? But the notion that it's, as Margaret was, it's okay to advocate for yourself, to raise your voice, to think about it in that way. Now that people often say, oh, that's generational. By the time we get to the baby boomers, the phones will be melting down at Rose Shop, or you won't be able to, But that assumes that ageism will just evaporate through the generations, right? Talk to me about advocacy just briefly.
That's me you're addressing.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Look, I think there can still be a point where everybody may need an advocate at some time. That's, we all do it in various other ways in our lives, not necessarily in a legal fashion, going to a lawyer or something, but there are times like that where you pick up on someone else's skills and wisdom and information about the system, and you go and talk to them and they support you. So I think we have to make that a fairly standard thing, that it's okay. We had to certainly argue for that initially with providers. We also had to argue the point about human rights. I remember people saying from large organisations that they'd do this human rights stuff if they just got more funding from the government. It still rings in my head, that one. But I think, the role of advocacy also is to give people some confidence, to help them understand their rights and that it's okay to speak up. And that is certainly a lot of what we had to do with seniors in residential care, was to say, look, it's really okay. Maybe with the best will in the world, the staff may not know what your problem is, may not know how something's impacting you. If you tell them, they can fix it for you, and hopefully they were willing to do that, and they may fix it for other people. So you might have an impact on others by speaking up. So I think it's all of that stuff about really informing people, supporting them to say, we can. I think the notion of empowering people, I don't see that as a magic wand that an advocate waves to anyone. I think we basically do that through supporting people, giving them information, helping them to have some confidence, get a good outcome. And with the best kind of advocate, we'll be doing that, looking at what the person wants, supporting them to help to have their voice heard, which is what it's all about, not speaking for them, but
we're going to just run 5 minutes over here because I've just got a couple more things I want to hear around the panel. Your thoughts listening to this, Debra, because I'm about to ask Marianne about the significance of this legislative change that has to be made by the middle of 2023, because this is after all these inquiries and all these years, this is the opportunity. What is, I'm going to ask you this question, and then I'm going to ask Margaret the same question. What does a genuine person-centred service look like? What's best practice?
I would say first and foremost, Ellen, it's flexible. It's person-centred. So treating everyone the same is not treating everyone equally is not treating everyone the same, should I say. It is about, understanding that we all come from different backgrounds, so appreciating the diversity of the person and delivering the care and services that is flexible to meet their needs. So it really is person-centred. In brief. I mean, I could go on for hours.
Margaret, what's your answer to that? Joining us from
my answer to that.
You're just on mute, Margaret. Just unmute yourself. There you are. Yeah.
Not everyone requires the same service at the one point of time. And somehow or other, there's this institutional type of behaviour that sort of says, no, you can't give someone a cup of tea out of schedule, or you can't do something at that time. They've all got to be respected and treated exactly the same. And they're not needing everything at exactly the same time. One nurse had said when I asked for a cup of tea during the night, that if you wanted 19 cups of tea, I'm prepared to bring it for you. And I thought, well, that's unreasonable on my behalf to do that. So there has to be a little bit of to and fro negotiating. But if people are constantly being left to their own devices, that's bad. Either that they have a severe dementia that they can't complete, whatever it is they want to appeal for on their own behalf, and they're entitled to do that. And I think it's when you raised it about the 3 scoops of ice cream. I was told I was a busybody speaking on someone's behalf. Let them do that for themselves. when they're incapable of doing it, completing something that you can see that they really want to have their 3 strips of ice cream. Or if someone is hurting them, the individual knows what the touch is or the feeling is like. But if you have 10 people entering at different stages in the process of that activity, you've lost it, because each one has a different view of the world.
Yeah.
So there has to be some strong supervision from adequately trained people in dementia care. And I suggest that the government should be paying for that.
Yeah, yeah. That's a wonderful view of person-centred care, and a very, very pertinent view given where you're joining us from today. So final comments, Mary Ann, this is it. This is the moment. I mean, every moment is the moment, but this is the moment with this new piece of legislation where everybody has to focus, as well as the work of advocacy and the ongoing, as you were saying, issues that people have to this day, locked down in residential aged care in ways that they wouldn't be if they were in school care, in ways that haven't been negotiated but have been dictated for their own good. And that's a debate we need to have, right? But what's at stake with this legislation?
What's at stake in this legislation is, if we don't move from the current legislation, is about the provider focus. And it's about, what do we do for older people, or do to, yeah? The new legislation must be about what older people want in order to support them to live a full life, fully participating in their community, fully participate, and then community has very different levels, and that they are seen. They're not done to, they're heard. Their voices, their needs, wants, desires are responded to. And I am concerned at this stage that government have come out and they've talked about, well, we'll have an act that's based on values. Well, if we get that, we're going to get something that's probably worse than what we've already got. The other thing is that if we only talk about rights, well, how do we talk about rights now? The current legislation has rights in it, but we've already just heard about the neglect and the apparent abuse and the systemic abuse of the current system. What happens to older people when they access the system. So it has to be about human rights, and we need to make sure that government do something with the new act, and it is enshrined. They do enshrine human rights in that act. And I do know that once the government do that, they will have to give us, as Australian citizens, a Bill of Rights or do something more. Victoria have got human rights legislation. Why can't we as a nation have that? And really be proactive about the individual and what they need, and our society is supported through whatever it is that they need.
Wonderfully said. Thank you all so very much for that. Special thanks to Margaret, to Ro, to Debra, to Mary Ann and Mary. Thank you so much for being part of that conversation. I know I'm to tell you that the digital annual report is available. I think in the chat link, we can throw it in the chat link at some stage for you all. I thank Philippa very much for the invitation to be part of your wonderful 30th anniversary celebrations. And we're going to conclude today with a video. It's wonderful. Please stay and watch it. Taking a look at the history of this organisation, a video that we've made that was really 30 years in the making. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm Edith Morgan, and I'm the chairperson of the Older Persons Action Centre. And I want to welcome all of you here today. It's wonderful to see you all, and such a variety of individuals and groups, I think, reflect some of the work that Older Persons Action Centre has been doing, and also the use and of the advocacy service. we're very proud to be able to take on that question of advocacy on behalf of people in nursing homes and hostels and potential residents. We sat down after we got the money from the Secretary to work out, well, what is our direction? Where are we going from here? We were to be an older person's action group. So we had to look at all sorts of areas, and there was a group of about 10 who worked in that way. And that's 5 years ago now, and I believe that the Old Person's Action Centre has come a long way. And I have to pay due credit to our members, because if it hadn't been for our wonderful members, we wouldn't be here today. And I'd like to put hands together for that. So that now it has legitimacy and it also has credibility. And we are unique in that sense that we include on the ground consumer groups who are taking up issues relating to older people.